And we're live.
We are live.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to episode 4 of the Weekly Supervised. And we have a very, very special guest today, somebody that if you are from SharpestMinds, you will probably know very well. So we have Russell Pollari here, who is the CTO at SharpestMinds. And there he helps data scientists, analysts, and engineers find work. He also talks about management, productivity, and a whole lot more of cool stuff on his Substack, so be sure to subscribe to that. And yeah, he's also one of my personal mentors, so I really appreciate how he taught me through. Yeah, so welcome, Russell. Do you want to talk a bit about yourself and give us a quick intro on, who you are and, how you kind of got to where you are at Sharpest Minds?
Yeah. So thanks for having me. I can give you the sort of the overview, and we can dive into any, I guess, specifics if you'd like. So right now I'm CTO of SharpestMinds. We are a data science mentorship marketplace. Currently, it's a very small company employee-wise. There's only 5 of us, but we have close to 400 mentors at the moment on our platform, and at least that many mentees who've connected with them. So I've been with SharpestMinds for about 4.5 years. We weren't always a mentorship marketplace. In fact, when the company was first formed by its founders, Edward and Jeremy, it was originally a restaurant recommender. So both were physicists by training, got very interested in machine learning, and decided they could, build an AI algorithm to recommend restaurants, and that would be their cool startup idea. Pretty soon on, they realized that was a dead end. They pivoted to a slightly different model where they tried to train basically former physicists like themselves, teach them data science and help them get jobs. And so the business was more of a sort of recruiting / placement kind of business. So you'd find some talent, you'd educate them in data science, and then you'd charge companies a recruitment fee for getting them jobs. And so right around that time is actually when I got involved in the company. So I had known both the brothers from my time as a physics grad student at U of T. Edward was a few years ahead of me. He worked just down the hall in another biophysics lab. Jeremy I had done some courses with in my first year of my master's degree. And I always kind of had friend crushes on the guys, but we were never super close. Anyway, one day, towards, halfway through my PhD, I had been kind of depressed and fed up with grad school and academia, and I had told my supervisor I was quitting without a plan of what the heck I would do afterwards. And so one day in the lunchroom, Edouard walks in, kind of nervous, sits down and starts pitching us his company called Yazabi, which would help me learn data science and help me get a job. And it was the perfect time for me going through an existential crisis. I said, yes, please, teach me data science, help me get a job. And so I ended up being one of the early users of what was then called Yazabi, which is now SharpestMinds. Maybe a few months later, I actually did land my first programming role. It wasn't necessarily in data science. I was writing a C++ library for a startup in Vancouver, a language I had actually never touched in my life before. So I took the job and trusted myself to learn all the skills on the go. And that was probably one of the most stressful couple months of my life, but one of the most instructional. So I was frantically trying to learn C++, a notoriously difficult language to master, while actually delivering a small microservice to the startup. I ended up delivering them something. I think it was pretty good, but that sort of sparked a love for programming in general. Soon after, Ed and Jer offered me a role at SharpestMinds, showing a lot of trust. They knew that I had also little experience with web development, but they trusted me to learn what I needed to. And so I joined with very little programming experience. I learned a lot as I went, and for a while I was basically the only developer at SharpestMinds, building our platform, which is now used by thousands of mentors and mentees on a daily basis, mostly on my own. Though recently we did hire another developer, so there's 2 of us building it at the moment, and that's been a huge shift in workflow, mindset, tooling, and all that. So there's the Cole's notes.
Brilliant. This is great. So that got me curious to ask a question from you. It might also be related to one of the questions that we had plans to ask you. So I'm trying to merge those 2 questions live in my head, so bear with me. The main question is, I'm really curious to know a little bit about your day-to-day. What does a CTO at a startup company of this size and this level of maturity, look like, and how this role has changed over time in the past couple of years, especially now that you have someone else who is helping you with the development stuff. But then the side question is, being a data science, or if you want to broaden it up, in analytics marketplace, what percentage of what you have built so far is enabled by, let's say, some machine learning models, or is it supposed to ever have something like that? Because you always get curious to test the things that you are selling to your customers, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I'll start with your second one. And maybe this will be a bit disappointing, but we don't actually utilize a lot of machine learning actively on our platform. And the answer is actually it ties with some advice you give a lot of folks who are new to the field. Is quite often, a machine learning algorithm is not the solution. Rules-based approaches will do just fine for a long time. There's no reason to complicate it with some extra infrastructure if you don't actually need it. That being said, there's a lot of space for SharpestMinds itself to utilize machine learning in the future. One thing we dabbled with in the past, and maybe this is the closest to an ML algorithm we have, is a recommender to suggest mentors to mentees and vice versa. And right now that's just a simple content-based, what interests do the mentors and mentees share? Are they in the same location? A couple other basic rules. And it works okay, but one thing we keep learning over and over again is that to make a successful mentorship, those hard skills don't really matter as much as the soft skills / personality culture fit. And those things are a lot harder to measure. But I'm thinking it's something we would want to and could solve in the future with both better data and maybe some dedicated data science folks on the team. To speak to your first question, what does my day look like? Well, I've always been kind of embarrassed to tell people I'm CTO. One, because I don't really have much experience doing anything technical before this, besides a PhD in physics, where I did a little bit of programming in MATLAB, and that 2-month contract for another startup. Plus, we were a small team, still are, and I got the CTO title because I was basically the only one who could write any code, more or less. Though Edouard and Jeremy also did a lot of coding in the early days before other responsibilities kind of took over. So most of the time, CTO at a small startup like this just means, I'm the engineering team, basically glorified web developer, but it also means handling things like infrastructure. So how do we get our app deployed? How do we make sure things are running correctly? Choosing what tools to use, making technical decisions. But most of my time, at least before we hired a new developer, was just writing code all day.
And I'm guessing you basically had the independence to make all those decisions and shots yourself, right? Being that one person engineering team.
That's right. So in many ways, that was an advantage. I absolutely love the autonomy, but it does mean I lack, like you would at any startup, you lack a bit of mentorship, right? At a larger company, I might have someone senior who could advise me on the best things, whatnot. So that means the code that Russell wrote, 2 years ago, not great. And I find a lot of the conversations with our new junior developer is just me apologizing for that terrible spaghetti code she has to deal with. But it is a great way to learn, right? Because I'm learning by experience. Like all the mistakes I made, I had to make on my own and fix on my own, and those lessons stick with you.
So I kind of have a follow-up question, and then we actually have a question from the audience after that. So related to what you mentioned about how, you're basically like, you were the one-person engineering team until you hired somebody else. Where did you go for advice about, big technical decisions, like what your tech stack should look like, how you should build out the platform, and so on and so forth? If you were like the one person on engineering, like where did you go for I guess, advice for that?
Yeah. I guess like the internet in general is full of, as we all know, full of tutorials and forums and courses, and I've made a lot of connections over the years. Luckily, like the co-founders of SharpestMinds, Edouard and Jeremy, are like somewhat technical. So for a while, before I not to be too blunt, surpassed them in technical ability, they were a good source of inspiration. And actually, before I joined, they had a developer working with them, Kieran, who ended up seeding a lot of knowledge, like in the company of basic web dev practices and whatnot. So when we started this, not when we started, but when I joined this company in its previous iteration, Yazabi, this sort of recruitment/training business, we were using an open source Slack clone called Rocket Chat, which is built with a framework called Meteor, Meteor.js, which is a fantastic full stack JavaScript framework for like spinning up prototypes. And we still use it today. Big fan. We may just be using it because it's the thing I was familiar with. So we basically forked Rocket Chat and started hacking away at that to make it do what we needed. And so my main introduction to full stack web development was just looking like, how did they do it in this open source project? And basically pattern matching and hacking away to do what I needed to do. Eventually, like Rocket Chat it was like incredibly bloated. It was built like Slack. It didn't really fit our use case once we pivoted to this mentorship program. And so that was one of the first like CTO decisions I had to make, was like, okay, we need to build like a brand new web application from scratch. And that was a tough one, because basically conventional wisdom, every time I Googled this question, people say, don't build from scratch, it's a mistake. But in this case, it was just like, Rocket Chat was riddled with technical debt. I barely understood how it was working. It was like loaded with features we didn't need, that I didn't understand. And it was just like not designed for our use case. So it ended up being the right call, I think, in retrospect. But when I built the new, I sort of took a lot of the patterns that I saw in the Rocket Chat code base and repurposed them for the new app. So I stuck with the tools I was familiar with, like Meteor, React on the front end, Node on the back end, and a lot of the patterns they used in defining their MongoDB collections, in passing data from client to server. I kind of just used them because that's what I was most familiar with. Not necessarily because I knew they were the right things to do, but I knew that just sticking with the things I knew would let us spin up this prototype app much quicker.
For sure, yeah, I think that's really cool, and that's also really awesome. Because honestly, like, I don't know if you remember, but you basically taught me like the data engineering portion during my SharpestMinds like fellowship. So thanks for that. That's really motivating. So we have a question from the chat, and it's actually about your PhD background. So, is your PhD background useful in any way for being the CTO of a startup, and what skills transfer to this job?
Okay, good question. Short answer, no. I had a poor experience in academia. I really did not enjoy what I was doing. I went in for the wrong reasons. I didn't know what the heck I wanted to do with my life. I thought physics was cool. I still think it's cool, but thinking something is cool is not the right reason to like devote 6+ years of your life to it. I guess there was probably some skills I learned, basic data analysis. I spent a lot of time programming in MATLAB. Not a language I recommend using for anything, but useful for numerical analysis, I guess, if you're a physicist or an experimentalist. And I found the parts of my day I enjoyed the most were when I had to write some software in MATLAB. And so that's probably where I got the most value. I learned that I liked to write code, and I learned that I did not want to do experimental biophysics. But for the most part, it felt like a waste of time, my whole PhD. And now my advice to most people who want to go to grad school is don't go to grad school. Unless, like, the only good reason to go to grad school is if you, like, are passionate about a topic and you really want to dive into it, reach the outer limits of knowledge and like bang your head against some hard problem. But it takes a lot of passion to keep up motivation during a PhD, which can slog on. Like the average length of a PhD in physics at U of T, at least, is like 7+ years. That's a lot of time in your life, and I felt like it mostly just slowed me down in life. I think I could have learned most of the skills I use now on my own. In fact, most of the skills I do use now, I did learn on my own after I quit my PhD. That being said, like, if I didn't go to grad school, I would not have met Ed and Jeremy Harris, the founders of SharpestMinds. So it sort of did lead to this serendipitous encounter to get me where I am.
So just one quick question, and it was supposed to be a joke that I shared with you before we start the call, and now I realize that this is a good time. Do you think that grad school or university in general is a good place to find a co-founder, or do you recommend some other venues?
To find a I never thought about that. It's probably a really good place to find a co-founder. What are the best places to find a co-founder? You want to hang out in places where people are building things, and have sort of an entrepreneurial mindset, but also are like building things in the same space that you're interested in. So a university definitely gets you in the same room as people who are like in the same field as you are, right? So it's a good like excuse to meet people in your discipline, I think. And there's probably aspects of college and university that lend to the sort of entrepreneurial mindset. Like if you go and join some of the clubs that I never joined while I was an undergrad, like the guys building chess algorithms and the guys building robots and racing cars and whatnot. I wish I got involved more with them in retrospect, because those were the builders. But for the most part, and I'm mixing things up, I think undergrad might be a good place, like an undergraduate degree might be a good place to meet a co-founder. But probably the best place just to find people who are building things. So any like club or team that has a goal to build something would be a good place. Grad school, perhaps. I guess like a lot of labs, there's a lot of innovation happening in them, not exactly mine. Finding a co-founder at least is not a good reason to go to grad school.
So the reason I'm asking you this question, it has something to do with one of our previous episodes where we were talking with Albert. So he's right now a CTO of a company in healthcare, but he also started with building things, right? And you were just talking about finding builders. I think there are two schools of thought usually when it comes to, co-founding a new business. One is where you start with a prototype, so you build things and then you realize there's a market for it. And the second one is where you know there's a market for it. You come from the business side, basically. You have an idea. You've spotted a pain point, and now you're looking for people who could help you build that thing, right? And if I wanted to put a spin on that same question, that would be along the lines of how many builders can actually be in the same room and try and build a startup successfully? how many technical people can be there on board, right? So for you guys, it actually makes sense because your customers are technical people. But generally speaking, what are your thoughts on that?
Like, how many builders does it take to build a startup?
That, and where do you draw the line? At what point do you think, because not all builders are good people for business development, they have to learn, right? Where do you draw the line? Where do you think that, or do you agree with that other school of thought that believes that you would probably be more successful or quickly get to revenue when you are on the idea side, and you always can potentially find somebody who is eager to learn, who could join the ship and build the thing for you, especially when you're talking about labs and university and whatnot. There's always talent that wants to join a startup, right? And they're super energetic and they always want to contribute. So do you think that, again, since we are looking in retrospect to a lot of decisions in the past couple of years, do you think that either one of these two schools of thought would be more successful based on all the startups that you've seen in the likes of, I don't know, Mars and all the other incubators that you've been part of? And I just wanted to mention that we also have two other questions in the lineup, so we'll get to you guys in just a minute.
Okay. Short answer, I don't really know. I think there's no right answer. There's a lot of combinations of people who can successfully found a startup, but I do think, and I feel pretty strongly about this, that you do need at least one technical founder. You need at least one builder. And I think, and I'm biased here, but like ideas are cheap, but actually executing is the hard part. And so I think having a default to building, to shipping, to getting things in front of users is way more valuable than someone who has an interesting idea about what might be a good business. So, but I think both things can be learned. You can definitely learn how to build, and there's like an amazing suite of tools out there that's making it easier and easier. I've relied on a lot of things that, like, if I joined SharpestMinds 10 years ago, I would be way out of my depth. So I think you can learn a lot to build an ideas, and I think the opposite is true. And I've seen this with the founders of SharpestMinds, who started out as similar to me, like introvert physicists, and who over the years, out of necessity, got better at sales, got better at marketing, got better at thinking about business and managing. And like, I watched them make that transition. And so I think it's very possible to learn in both directions. But you got to be able to build things no matter what.
Yeah, I love that perspective and that answer. Honestly, like growth mindset is something I've been reading about a lot, and I think kind of like what you mentioned really encompasses that. Also, just like your story about how you guys, you Ed and Jeremy had like learned how to do everything you need, kind of like on the go. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So we have a few questions in the chat. Our first question is from Chris, and he's asking, how was the transition to bringing on a second developer? How did you have to shift your thinking about things or planning and tooling? Did you have to shift any of the way that you've done things before now that you have somebody else on the like engineering team?
Good question. Basically everything changed. And I think every time we add a new person to the team, there's probably going to be a paradigm shift. So one thing I realized immediately is how much like process and knowledge just lived in my head. So, as soon as there's a second person, it's like, okay, now we have to start documenting processes and actually coming up with well-defined processes that we can follow and that a new developer might be able to follow. And a lot of that stuff wasn't obvious until it's like, I get questions from the new dev going like, how do we do this again? And I go, oh yeah, we just do it this way. Why? We've always done it that way. And I found myself answering that question a lot. Because a lot of the patterns and whatnot I just stole from Rocket Chat way back when, without any real reason for it. So documentation, actually like coming up with good processes and better, had to think about project management in a more serious way. Because in the past, a lot of the time it was like, okay, Russ, go build this thing. I'd go work on it myself and return it. But now you have to communicate, make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes, make sure you're aligned with the sort of technical decisions you're going to make. So task tracking became important all of a sudden, documentation became important all of a sudden, and defining well-defined processes became more important.
That's great. I think that's a really important tip, especially for those out there who are watching this right now and who are potentially CTOs or who are building their own companies. So I think that's super helpful.
Sure. Yeah, I would actually, one thing, because I was talking to a mentee recently who joined a startup as one of the first devs, and quickly realized this problem, that the senior folks had not documented anything. And it's not necessarily a flaw on their part. It's like, it would have been a waste of time for me to document every process I followed if I'm the only one who needs to know them. But like, your need for documentation increases with the number of people. But it's a great way to add value when you join the company and be like, hey, I'm new here. I realize you don't have this process well documented. I can do that for us. And it's a good way to sort of show that you're thinking about the productivity of the team in general and start adding value really early.
Yeah, and I think like from a mentee standpoint, also just like being the one to document those processes like helps me to like understand whether or not they're actually the right ones, and communicating like how much you understand with like the senior folks who, basically built what you're working on. So yeah. So our next question is actually from Rajat. Turns out I'm not the only one who follows the stuff that you write. So he says, "Hi Russell, in one of your articles you mentioned about burnout. I would like to hear your thoughts as to how to know the signs and how to get over it."
Yeah, good question. So burnout, I think, manifests differently for everybody. At least that's what we've seen on our team. And so I think it's important it's something you got to learn what your burnout signals are. And it also is helpful to have teammates who can also recognize your stress signals, because sometimes it's not obvious to you. So having like if there's anyone in your life who you're close with, telling them, hey, if you notice I'm like getting irritable, because for me, when I start to feeling burnt out, I get, tired, I get irritable, I'm very extra combative and argumentative, and it just gets really hard to focus. So I think it's important to learn what those signs are, which can be a little tricky. But if you find yourself like staring at your screen, stuck on the same problem forever, without motivation, it might mean you're just burnt out and you need to take a break. And that's totally okay, right? Because you can sit in your chair all day and try and like churn out some work, but it's probably going to cost you and the company you're working for in the long run, because you're going to produce subpar work, your burnout will continue, and that, poor work ethic will continue. So learn your stress signals. Try to have teammates or loved ones who can watch out for your stress signals for you and be honest with you about it. That's something I'm really grateful to have at our team at SharpestMinds. And it helps too if you've got a team that can trust you to take the time when you need it. That's not a privilege everyone has at their jobs, but take the break if you need it and if you can afford it.
This might be actually a good time before I ask you my next question. I think since Rajat mentioned about your articles, tell us a little bit about your articles, your newsletter, for anybody who wants to follow you on that front as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I've been blogging on and off for the last couple of years. Writing is a habit I'm really trying to cultivate, that I think everyone should cultivate, and there's a lot of reasons why I think that. But RussellPollari.com is where my blog lives, and now I've got a newsletter as well on Substack, RussellPollari.substack.com. Maybe we could link that in the video description. So writing, especially blog posts, is one of those things that's super high leverage, because you might write a shitty blog post or two or 5 or 100, but no one really cares. Like, they'll just go, oh, that wasn't so great. They won't bother sharing it with their friends, whatnot. But you might just have one blog post that resonates with a few people, that gets shared, that goes viral, that increases your exposure in some way, like builds your audience or builds your clout, or a hiring manager notices it and offers you a job. I've seen that happen with a few mentees. Like, they wrote the right blog post, it got in front of the right pair of eyes, and they got a job out of it. It won't happen with every post, but basically the upside is huge and the downside is very limited. All it is like, you got to put the time in to actually write. And writing is a habit we try and cultivate personally and at SharpestMinds, because good writing equals clear thinking. You might think you understand a topic well, or have an opinion on something, until you actually have to write down your arguments and lay it out in like a linear, legible fashion. This happens to me all the time. I thought I had a well-defined opinion on this, but it turns out my thoughts are still muddied. I can't even write it on paper. So it really helps clarify your thinking. It's a great way to solidify the things you've learned if you're teaching yourself something. And it's a great way to, either build an audience or get the attention of people higher up who might be able to like level up your career.
All right, brilliant. Yes, and we will share the links both to our YouTube, and if anybody who is here and would like to join our Slack channel, the link is also there. We'll also share all the resources on Slack as well. So now to my most important question from you, Russell. I'm really curious to know how you personally also work with your mentees on SharpestMinds. What's the process? How do you define projects? Do you usually define them in a way that would also benefit what you're building for SharpestMinds? Because I've seen that with a few mentors in conversations that we've had as well. Or is it something that would basically ideally land them a job as soon as possible, or somewhere in between? It depends on the mentee. Also, has this process also changed over time, over the course of years, similar to how your process is as the full stack developer or the CTO has changed? So the question is basically many faces question.
Mm-hmm.
So feel free to elaborate on any part that you feel comfortable.
Sure. So every mentee, every person has a different set of needs, and I think mentoring really depends on the needs, interests, life of that person you're mentoring. But there's a few commonalities in how I like to approach it. In the context of say, SharpestMinds, mentoring folks who are trying to break into the data science industry. So you probably already know that I'm a big believer in learning by building. So like, you only get so much value from doing tutorial after tutorial, or solving some cookie cutter Jupyter Notebook data set or something like that. When you're working on the job as a data scientist, as a data engineer, as any sort of programmer, like, your real job is to make hundreds of tiny decisions every day. So like, the tiniest of decisions, like, how will I name this variable? How will I name this function? What library will I use for building the model? What library will I use from API, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on and on. And the only way to get good at making those decisions is to have practice making those decisions. So the best way is to just like throw yourself at a problem and try to solve it, and force yourself to have to make these sort of decisions, like, and make trade-offs between certain things, and like maybe build the wrong thing and learn a valuable lesson from that. Like, oh yeah, I initially tried to deploy this on Heroku, but turns out Heroku has a size limit and my model wouldn't fit some actual things. You're able to make smart trade-offs in the future. You kind of show that you've got a mindset of solving problems, that you can learn from your mistakes. And that's what you get from building something. And when I say building something, I don't mean a Jupyter Notebook. I actually don't like Jupyter Notebooks too much. I know they're pretty valuable for beginners to spin up and for EDA, etc. But no production code base is written in Jupyter Notebook. So I think diving into like writing production-ready code as soon as possible, even if it's messy at first, because you'll learn like why certain things are valuable. once you have to do a major refactor of your code, you'll learn why writing modular code is so valuable, because it makes making these changes so much easier, right? If my model was just defined in a single function in a single folder, like changing it to a new model will be pretty easy. But if I've got it like scattered all around my code base, like that change is gonna be a lot harder to make. And so there's tons of advice out there on what best practices are, but the best way to actually learn or internalize that advice is to hit these problems yourself and learn it yourself. So I try to get my mentees to build things. I think the most important factor of what to build is like something that's interesting to them, something that they can be motivated to actually solve. Like the Titanic data set or predicting customer churn on some random other data set, not very exciting for most people. So find a problem you're interested in, work on that, grind away yourself as much as possible. And then the best mentees treat their mentors as a valuable resource, right? Mentor's not a teacher, though I do try and teach a little bit to my mentees when I see an opportunity. Here's the thing I know that I can teach to you. But it's more of a guidance, more of a direct, not dictate role that a mentor plays. And but every mentorship I've done through SharpestMinds has been different because life happens, right? Maybe a lot of the times we'll be building a project together, and then all of a sudden they've got a bunch of interviews lined up, and so let's just pivot to the most valuable thing we can do at this moment, which is practice for those interviews and help you get the job. So you really just got to roll with what the mentee is doing, where their life's taking them, and provide the best support you can given their situation.
So I just wanted to add one quick thing. Since we talked about Jupyter Notebooks, we plan to have a fun debate at some point, and this could be the topic for that. So I cannot guarantee that we can bring on Jeremy Howard to talk about MBDev and go against you, but we will try and have somebody who is for Jupyter Notebooks, or maybe we could just do it similar to how NeurIPS does it. So we force Russell to be in favor of Jupyter Notebooks and then have a little bit of fun. So stay tuned. At some point, Russell, I hope that you would accept our invite to be on this, most probably a 4-person debate, so teams of 2. And then we'll just take your name out of a ball. And then if you are supposed to be in favor of Jupyter Notebooks, that would be a fun conversation for sure.
That could be fun.
Yeah.
My qualm, like, I think they have their place, but my major qualm with notebooks is, especially when you start and that's all you know, is like there's so much going on under the hood that you just don't understand. And I experienced this myself with MATLAB as a grad student. So if you're not familiar with MATLAB, it's like a sort of a numerical programming language, not open source, quite expensive actually, at least last time I remembered. But the way I used it, like it was in this IDE that I basically needed to spin up to run a program. Everything was there, a little console at the bottom. I'd write my code at the top and, press a button to run the software. And when I started learning Python, like I got so confused because I didn't really understand, like someone was just writing a text file and running it somehow. And the way I was used to programming was in this like nice, pretty IDE that handled all the hard stuff for me. Like, so what is a compiler? Like, how do I run software? How would I even put something on the cloud? And what does that mean? Like, I didn't have to think about them. And I think Jupyter Notebooks kind of do that. Like, you don't realize that you can run a Python script right from the command line. And I'd have to prepare a bit for that debate, clearly, but that's something around why I do not like them.
Yeah, and so I guess before our next question, I just wanted to add, as a mentee, from the mentee standpoint on SharpestMinds, just wanted to, again, thank Russell. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but the very first web app that I ever like deployed like in my life on Heroku, I got a lot of like mentorship and advice from Russell about that. So like learning how to use that and like Unicorn, all of that stuff, and like literally learning command line and what virtual environments were for. So yeah, again, just a quick plug. If you guys haven't checked Sharpest Minds app yet, you definitely should. The best. And yeah. So our next question is actually about, well, joining a startup. So what are some lessons that you can share for anyone who wants to join an early stage startup as one of the first technical people? And what value should they care about? What red flags should you watch out for, given that you are one of the very first, not only technical person to join?
Yeah, good question. One, beware of over-engineering, I think is one of the number one lessons that I've had to learn the hard way a few times. Because a startup is essentially an experiment. You've got a hypothesis about a product or a service that people will like, but you have really no idea if they will like it or use it until it's in front of them and people can try it. And so it's easy to get stuck in a trap where you want to make it perfect and really make the code solid and robust and whatnot before you release it. And then you do and nobody uses it and it was all for naught. So watch out for over-engineering. Try and come up with the simplest version possible to test your hypothesis. And that might mean that the first version of your product is just a Slack channel and not, a fully functional messaging app that you use. The second, and this is something I had to learn myself as well, was not to reinvent the wheel. So coming from a physics background, I always kind of looked down on using pre-built solutions. I liked to build things myself and understand what was going on under the hood. But that's just not feasible if you want to, build some working software quickly. So if someone's already built it, if there's already an open source library or there's already a tool that you can pay a little bit per month to use that instead. It's going to save a ton of time, ton of headache. You won't have technical debt to deal with, et cetera, et cetera. And and I'm just so grateful for all the tools out there that have made my life easier as a self-taught, first technical hire. So things like Stripe means I don't have to think at all about the complexities of handling payments and credit cards and sensitive information. And I'm blanking, but there's like a million other tools that have been invented from other companies that make your life easier as a developer. So use those.
All right, so I have a quick story to share before, and I mean we have other kind of smaller questions to ask you, but if anybody in the audience also wants to share their questions, please feel free to do so. We still have about 15 minutes of Russell's time, and I really intend to use all of it because this is valuable. The story I wanted to share, this actually happened just today. We were having a chat on a closed Slack channel, and Russell was on that chat, and one of the mentors was asking for a feature, see whether or not that feature is feasible to be developed / implemented / deployed as soon as possible. And I just heard, and I think this happened about 10 a.m., around 10 or 11 a.m. today, Eastern time, so roughly speaking, half a day is, like half a working day is probably a good estimate. And when we started having a chat with Russell about an hour ago, he told me that this is already a PR. Is that correct? So that, yeah. So that kind of is a segue into asking the question of agility of implementation and deployment in a startup like SharpestMinds, especially if you're the only person or a team of two. How do you manage that? How do you manage expectations, especially the ones that are coming from your business partners versus the ones that are coming from the mentors are basically your products. You're selling their time to your customers. So how do you manage to do that if they're contradictory? How do you say no to, let's say, a 3-person startup?
Yeah, good question. So for context, one of our mentors As for context, a very small feature, I happen to have basically my day open, and so I decided to implement it really quickly because I had the time. He sort of caught me in a maintenance cycle. So the way we approach development at SharpestMinds is to do basically alternate between a cycle where we push on major features for our web application, and then we break those up with smaller maintenance cycles where we either pay off technical debt or tackle small bugs or do some sort of smallish maintenance tasks. And so we happen to be in one of those. The previous iteration of this this approach I used to call Fix Up Fridays. So I basically allot every Friday to do maintenance and bug work and random grab bag tasks. So one of our mentors, Ray, just suggested this on a whim. I said I built it and I actually deployed it just before this call, which I felt good about it. But that is an exception, not the rule. So most of the time you do have to say no a lot. We're really lucky to be close with our users. So basically all our mentors and mentees are hanging out in a Slack workspace, and they know the team, they know me, and they're not shy to request features. And most of them are good ideas, but we have limited bandwidth to build things. So we've got a pretty well-defined process on how we decide what to build and where to focus our attention. And it's important to stick on that focus and not just build every little thing everybody asks for. But sometimes there's little tiny features that I know will take no time, and if it delights someone on our platform, then it's usually worth building. If this happened on another Friday during one of our sort of product cycles, I would not have done this.
That's awesome. Honestly, and just agree with what Russell said. So yeah, I'm on the Slack, and Russell is super, super active at getting everyone's perspectives on, just the platform. And honestly, it's been really cool to see how you guys have grown since I first joined. Just the biggest fan of this mind. So we have another question actually about the engineering team. So how do you see the SharpestMinds engineering team growing in the coming months or years? Are you guys going to be hiring soon?
I hope to be hiring soon. I think our next hire will be a designer, like a UX UI designer. This is something I was always skeptical that you could justify paying someone full time to just be a designer, but after having to butt my head against design over and over again, it's actually really, really hard to design things that people like, that are intuitive, that solve the actual problem people are trying to solve. So I think the ideal team working on a feature for me is a couple developers and a designer. So right now we've got one other developer aside from me. Probably the next hire will be a designer and another developer, but it's hard to say who the next hire will be. Someone who's doing more data analytics or data science might be cool to finally have some real expertise on our team doing that. A little ironic considering we're a data science marketplace.
That's awesome. So designers out there, you guys, make sure to build up your portfolios. Russell might be hiring sometime. So we have another question from Daniel. And he says, so this is about what you just shared earlier. So how do you prioritize tasks and features? And how do you kind of do the estimates or demand when you get these features?
Yeah, so we actually utilize an approach called Shape Up that some folks at Basecamp came up with. It's a way to think about product development that I fell in love with a couple years ago. Of course, we've modified it a bit to fit our specific workflows, but the idea is to before we build anything, to write it up in sort of a pitch. here's my pitch for the feature. So that pitch should have a few things. Like, first of all, why? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And that's the first check. Like, if that problem is not well aligned with what our business goals are or what our most pressing problems are, then the whole pitch is discarded. So first of all, it has to be justified with our basically company vision and what we know to be our most pressing problems at the time, or where we want the product direction to go. So that's sort of a separate question that we return to on a monthly cadence. Like, are we building the right thing? What are our pressing problems? Where should we be focused? So anyone on the team can write up one of these pitches, basically have some background, and then write up a sort of a detailed pitch over like what exactly are we going to build. The idea being like it should be detailed enough that you could hand it off to, say, a developer and a designer, and they could build it without asking more questions from management. So that's sort of the level of detail you want. Not like wireframes and super high level detail, but like a good low level approach that answers all the sort of, what are the must-haves of this problem? What are the sort of constraints of it? Like, I encourage you to look up Shape Up. There's a free online book, and it's a great approach to product development and product management that we use. So after every cycle, we have a maintenance cycle, which I think is super useful because on any code base, no matter how large, like there's going to be maintenance. There's going to be libraries that get updated. There's going to be bugs that you didn't know of before. There's going to be random requests from your mentors to add a new feature every now and then. And it's important to keep up that maintenance because technical debt will build up, and it's good to just continuously pay it off so it doesn't get to a too high amount, if that makes sense. So after every cycle, we actually have all the pitches that are written up at the time from anyone on the team get voted on, and the one with the most votes, that's what we build. And instead of estimating how much time it might take, which is notoriously hard for software, we instead use appetites, and this is another part inspired by Shape Up. Given what the feature is and what the problem it's solving, how much time are we willing to bet on it? So it's more like, okay, I'm willing to spend 3 weeks on this. No more than 3 weeks. So then it becomes not how long will this take, but like, what can we build that matches the spec within that time? And that's been a super useful way to frame things.
So this is something that I personally had I still have a huge challenge with it. I've tried Appetite before as well, and I want to know what your approach is towards cases where you spent your basically 2 weeks and 4.5 days, and you're still not there. What do you do with them? Do you just abandon them in the GitHub repository and never get back to them, or do you add another day or two to your 3 weeks?
Yeah, it depends. So a useful framework for thinking about this is thinking about the work that needs to be done as either uphill work or downhill work. So if you imagine like being on one side of a hill and looking up, right, you can't see the other side. So this is like work that you have to do where you don't really have a good sense of what's involved, and so that's uphill. And that means that kind of work is really, really hard to estimate, right? You don't know how long it's going to take because there's unknowns and unknown unknowns. Then eventually you work on something enough, or you've solved a similar problem, so you have a good estimate like that. You can judge that this is like an hour or a day or two to solve. So when you can see the bottom of the hill, it's downhill work. So that's a super useful framework. So as you're going through the appetite, it's important to like track the different pieces that are still left to build, and either if they're uphill or downhill. So when you're approaching the end of the cycle and you still have a lot of the chunks of stuff left to do that are still uphill work, that means you don't know how much more time you'll need. So it's probably time to abandon, which is a hard thing to do. And maybe the feature's important enough to just continue at it. Like in a startup, a lot of the time that's the case. You've got like critical things that are essential for your company. But sometimes like you were only willing to bet 3 weeks on this, and it looks like it's going to take a lot more than 3 weeks, so let's abandon it and move on to the next thing. But if you're nearing the end of the cycle and everything's downhill work, you can see the bottom, there's just a few things less to change, you know it'll take a few days, then it's probably worth extending that cycle and finishing.
Thanks so much for that. I feel like you could kind of use that process not just for like building on teams, but like building stuff yourself too. I mean, I'm definitely gonna take away some of what you mentioned as well. So we're almost running out of time, so we're gonna close with one last question. For other Russell fans out there who keep up with his Substack like me, and all of his like writing, do you have like, you know, top 3 productivity tips for us watching out there, especially during like COVID when we're all like working at home, probably on like remote teams? Anything that's helped you throughout this kind of like turbulent time?
Top 3. That's a tough one. I think the things that have helped me the most are keeping a daily journal. It's just a good way to provide some time to like actively reflect on, say, how you're feeling, what you should be working on, what you should be doing. It doesn't really matter what you write down. It just matters that you're taking the time to just think a little bit about how you spent your day, for example. And that can go a long way. The other, get lots of sleep. I think when I was a grad student, I was like always tired and I could never focus, and I thought that was just life. But it turns out I just wasn't sleeping enough. Game changer. So the days that I don't get enough sleep, it's a wash. I'm completely unproductive. That's kind of a cliche tip, but it's absolutely true. And the other is like trying to be explicit about what you're working on and when. So I have this problem a lot, like especially working on the computer, especially working at home, there's distractions everywhere. I find myself, if I've got a short break, I'm waiting for my new code changes to build, I might quickly check Twitter or something, but then, I see something on Twitter that distracts me. Next thing I know, I'm scrolling forever. So you want to limit those distractions. So what I actually do is sign out of all the social medias when it's time to actually be productive. And that includes things like Slack and Gmail, which are distraction factories. But it's hard sometimes when you're doing all your work on there. So, it depends where you are. But if you can limit your time on Slack and checking your inboxes, that's a huge win. And being explicit about like, okay, for the next hour, I'm working on this, and then only working on that one thing for the next hour. A hard habit to cultivate, but it helps, at least me, what I do, or what I've been doing for a while to go, I've got sort of a text document where I'll just write down what my current task is. So I'm being very explicit and upfront about it, and just having it written down helps a lot, because then if I find myself distracted, I can refer back to that document going like, oh, this is not what my current task is. Like, I'm off focus. Let's get back to it.
That's awesome. I feel like what you mentioned about, especially like checking your notifications thing, like I personally like am obsessed with checking my emails all the time, so I will definitely use that tip. And so with that, we are done with like episode 4. I just wanted to again thank Russell for being here, and you guys should definitely check out his Substack and SharpestMinds, and come back again next week for the same time, new guest, new topic. And again, we are the Weekly Supervised. I'm Amber, and this is Armand. And yeah, we're excited for you to be a part of our community. I don't know, Armand and Russell, if you guys have any last closing words.
Thanks a lot. That was a lot of fun. If you're not on SharpestMinds already, come check us out and go subscribe to my Substack. You'll be in the first 100 subscribers, so that'll be a big deal in the future to boast to your friends about.
That's on my to-do list for sure right after this call. Thank you again, Russell. This was a lovely conversation. I know we are going to continue this conversation with probably a little bit more sophisticated, more challenging questions that I usually have for you on Slack. But I really appreciate the time that you took off of your busy Friday, and looking forward to having another one of these with you. Thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Cheers.
you.